Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would want to thank the organising committee for the kind invitation. And those of you who have missed your siesta, I have some sympathy with you. My body clock, after travelling from New Zealand last night, is at 5 a.m. in the morning, so forgive me if I fall asleep up here. What I'm going to talk about is the on-farm part of the supply chain. Perhaps Lars, in the talk before lunch, he talked about production efficiency, and I'm going to touch a bit on environmental efficiency as well. So that's the area I'm going to concentrate on. Now, New Zealand is a grassland economy. 55% of our export earnings come from livestock. Grazed pasture, in situ, supplies 95% of the diet of our animals, and sheep and beef cattle, as opposed from dairy, are the predominant land use, occupying 66% of agriculture and forestry land. And the first talk this morning, that is fairly similar to Uruguay, actually, those numbers. The meat industry employs 25,000 people in New Zealand, and it's the largest of our manufacturing employers in New Zealand. We're an export, we export meat to hundreds of different products worth a total of 6.3 billion to over 120 countries around the world in 2013. 80% of our beef is exported, 92% of our sheep meat, 90% of our wool, and I added in dairy there, 95% of dairy products are sent out of the country. So we're a major exporter. Our numbers have been declining in all livestock except dairy. So if you look at sheep, if you go back to 1985, we had just over 67 million sheep in New Zealand. That number has now declined to just over 30 million, so it's more than halved. Dairy cattle has been the big increase from 3.3 to 6 million. Beef cattle has dropped down, it's been going up and down, but it's down about 1 million on the 1985 numbers. And deer has collapsed as well in terms of numbers, and goats are relatively unimportant in New Zealand. So numbers have been declining, and there's been a land use change. So the red line there is the land area devoted to sheep and beef cattle, the pastoral land, and the blue line on the bottom, so that's been going down 27%, and the blue line on the bottom is the increased land area going into dairy, and that's been going up. But it's not just the loss of land in sheep and beef has not just been dairy, there's also been land retired for environmental conservation purposes, and some land going into small, what we call lifestyle blocks close to cities. So there's been a decline in pastoral grazing land area. And so farms have changed in terms of size. And it's been quite big, and you've got to go into these numbers a bit more in the sheep and beef sector, and the number of hill country farms have declined from 7,500 to 6,200, so a drop there of 17%. And that's mainly been because of land going into forestry or conservation. It's the next line, the number of finishing and breeding farms for our beef and sheep, that have declined the most, and that land area has really gone on to dairying or dairy support. And that means that most of our sheep and beef cattle now are being run in hill country, away from the flatter areas where improved grassland can take place. It has to be in hill country where the options to improve grassland become less. So that has some consequences in terms of our opportunity to increase or improve production as we go forward into the next 20 to 25 years. So we've got fewer farms, so there's the farm numbers from 1984 through to 2006-07. Sheep and beef farms have declined 38%, but the farms have got bigger. That's probably a worldwide trend in terms of grazing livestock farms. The numbers of animals that people are looking after have got larger. In the case of our sheep and beef unit, we measure livestock units as one sheep, which sort of indicates the predominance of sheep in New Zealand. I was intrigued this morning that Uruguay is 4 cattle to every Uruguayan person. In New Zealand, there is 7 sheep to every person. So the average farmer in New Zealand looks after 4,000 stock units as opposed to 3,400 in 1985. So farms have got bigger. The sheep industry has changed from wool, and this change took place a number of years ago, so it's now meat dominant. Lamb meat is the vogue for every farmer. They move to producing more lambs per ewe, increasing the weight of those lambs at slaughter. And they're trying to get those lambs to slaughter weights much earlier, as soon as possible after weaning. Merino and fine wool breeds are minor, less than 10% of the total number of animals in the national flock, and the main breeds of sheep are Bromley, Perrindale, Coopworth and composites, which are reflecting those main maternal breeds. We supply 50% of the world lamb meat trade. Now that's not sheep meat, we only supply about 35% of sheep meat, but when we talk about lamb, most of the lamb meat trade in New Zealand, the world lamb meat trade, we're the dominant supplier of that meat. Supply 45% of the carpet wool trade, 10% of the unprocessed skins. But our supply is lumpy, and that bottom graph there shows the lumpiness of the supply, with peak supply occurring January, February, March, April, May, usually 1 to 2 months after the peak supply and pasture growth on a seasonal basis. So that creates problems in our export industry. You know, if we're wanting to have continual supply chains, we have peaks of supply for 6 months of the year, and then in the shoulders we have some supply, and then in the late winter, early spring we have minimal supply, which makes it difficult for our marketers and processors to keep their plants open and keep their orders open in the Northern Hemisphere, where most of our product goes. Northern Hemisphere used to be where most of our product goes. Like most other countries, China has just taken over as a dominant market for our lamb, taking 39% of our lamb trade up until the 31st of March 2014. United Kingdom took 16%, and then a host of other countries. The China growth has not only been in lamb, which this shows that from March 1989, where hardly any product went to China. The increase, which is this blue line here, is the lamb trade. There's also been a rapid rise in beef trade into China. So like everyone else, we've picked up supply into that market. It hasn't been the high value product. It's typically been slightly lower value than the product we might put into Europe, especially in lamb, and also in beef that we might put into South Korea or Japan. But nevertheless, it's a market that is growing and becoming important. And it's one of the things that we have to keep mindful of in New Zealand, in that market, that rapid increase. Lost the mouse. That rapid increase that occurred there, that could also, and Uruguay I know has moved into supply of that market, that could also occur in Indonesia or India and other Southeast Asian countries. It could just turn over in the next 3 or 4 years, and there could be another market that comes in. For lamb, the interesting thing is that we've diverted lamb from UK into that market and Europe, and nothing has been available to fill back into the UK market. And so there is a shortage of lamb worldwide, and when you think of the lamb producing countries in the world, I don't think anyone's going to step up and fill that in terms of trade, because 94% of lamb is consumed in the country of origin where it's grown. Only about 7% goes into trade. So there'll be a gap there, which is nice for sheep producers in the world that market. The product mix has also changed. So here we have the product mix going back to 1970, where most of the product that left New Zealand was in a frozen form, the green line, and you see the declining in the frozen carcass form. The yellow here is the increase in frozen cuts, so some processing, and then some more processing going on in the factories. The purple line there being chilled frozen boneless cuts, and the bottom area being chilled cuts. So that's increased as well. So there's been a change in the product mix that leaves the country. The beef industry in New Zealand, 3.7 million cattle, but you sort of have to include the 6.3 million dairy cattle as part of that. There's 1 million beef breeding cows. It's pasture-based. The dairy sector is an integral part of the beef industry, supplying about 400,000 calves each year. So about 35% of the calves that enter into the beef industry come from the dairy industry. The beef industry is dominated by Angus, and second comes Hereford, and then there's some other crosses with dairy breeds. The United States dominates our beef exports, taking 46%, and then China has now moved up into be second place, just ahead of Japan in terms of our beef exports. But the United States, and it's mainly processing beef, or as we like to call it, trying to move it up the value chain, we call it ingredient beef. Go back a few years and it was called manufacturing beef. Level of performance on our farms has increased ahead of everything else in our economy. So there's been a 3.3 compound annual growth rate since 1984, whereas the forestry sector has only grown at 1.6 and the wider economy at only 1%. And that's been achieved by some quite dramatic figures on farm. 25% increase in lambing percentage, a 3.5 kilo increase in carcass weight, and when you translate those figures into growth rates, it's probably been an increase of about 50 grams a day, and then bigger farms have been a 35% increase in productivity in terms of labour unit. So things have improved, and then if you look at these productivity increases, perhaps on a more friendlier basis for people to understand, the lambing percentage, number of lambs weaned, ewes put to the ram, has increased from 101 to 119. Kilograms of lamb weaned per ewe from 9.8 to 16.4, and the average lamb carcass weight moved up to 18 kilos. And not such a dramatic increase in beef performance, but nevertheless some increase. So the overall position in New Zealand has been a huge increase in dairy production. There's been more beef and veal, less lamb, minus 4%, but don't forget that's come from a huge drop in sheep production, in sheep numbers. Okay, so we've dropped our numbers, but have been able to maintain our production almost. There remains huge untapped potential. So these are some numbers from our Beef and Lamb New Zealand, which is a data gathering service, divided into quintiles. And so the second to bottom quintile, most farmers in New Zealand, like anywhere else in the world, focus on lamb price per head, but really the lamb sales kilograms per hectare or dollars per hectare are probably the more normal measures, because land is often the limiting factor. So the bottom quintile, 44, and the high quintile in this year, which was 2012, $103, a plus 32% increase, or dollar terms plus 48% moving from the lower to the bottom. So there's opportunity for our farmers to move up the value chain, if you like, in terms of their returns to their farms. So the other thing, that most of that increase that I talked about before, in terms, the sheep numbers declining but production remaining the same, has come from an age group of farmers where the average age now is 58. So the challenge now in New Zealand, and it's been talked about, is that the young farmers are the next group that are going to take it through and do that same increase in the next 20 to 30 years. And that's sort of what we're hoping, because that older age group, the so-called baby boomers, are exiting farming, and there's a new group coming through who are keen to move production along. And the government has recognised this and has got a growth agenda where they want to increase the ratio of exports to GDP from the current 30% to 40% by 2025. And most of that's going to come from agriculture. Luckily, and sometimes our governments don't recognise this, but the current government realises that agriculture is where it's at in New Zealand. And the throwaway phrase would be, can we produce 1,000 kilograms of meat? Can we produce... we have, in farmlet trials at Massey University, produced 720 kilograms of lamb meat per hectare on herb pastures on an annual basis. People have put in Ag-Research have done 1,000 kilograms of bull meat, Frisian bull meat per hectare. So that's sort of the potential. So the scope for improvement, and when you go back to that previous slide, the scope to be done in existing farm levels out there. So I'm going to give you just some ideas of where we see the potential in New Zealand to improve. And some of these apply throughout the world, certainly in sheep and probably in beef as well. So one of the things that we haven't succeeded in New Zealand is breeding from ewe lambs. Only 30% are bred at 6 to 7 months of age, whereas the majority are bred at 18 months of age to lamb first at 2 years of age. And we've developed management guidelines. The main thing about that is live weight at breeding, and certainly our research and our research trials, we've shown that if we can move live weight up to around the 40 kilos, then we can get scanning percentages of around 125%. with the proviso that if we go out slightly higher, we can get bigger scanning percentages, but it's diminishing returns. And with the advent of electronic EI identification, we've gone out into bigger flocks and been able to produce numbers like this. So that here we've recorded 15,000 ewe hoggets on about 5 different properties throughout New Zealand, and so we've developed these relationships which farmers can use. So this first one is the fertility, so that's how many get pregnant per 100 presented to the ram, and you can see that again it's a diminishing return that we can get up around 90% when we get into the mid-40s, but there is a wastage as we go up there trying to push them out too heavier for our current genetics that we have in the New Zealand sheep flock. And then you move to the next slide, which is fecundity, or in other words, the number of fetuses present per 100 hoggets that were mated. And again, we can increase it out towards 140 as we move out towards that 45 kilograms, but then it starts to decline out there. So a huge opportunity for our farmers to improve production there, and I'll come back to that point towards the end. And then the next one is we can still increase weight of lamb wean per ewe per year. And there's 2 aspects there. Firstly is survival, and that sort of certainly has welfare connotations. You know, we still lose 15%, still lose 10% in singles, 15 to 20 in twins, and 25% in triplets at birth. And that has welfare and market connotations going forward. But I mean, it's the same in most sheep flocks throughout the world. So we have opportunity to improve that. Live weight gain, while the lambs graze on, are still on the ewe, can be increased. So we've focused certainly on defining optimum feeding conditions for the ewe. We talk now about targeted feeding. You know, those of you who are familiar with New Zealand systems, it's all in the past. It's been about big numbers, 6 dogs and managing 10,000 sheep. Now we're starting to think about, certainly with electronic identification, that we manage flocks for specific individuals within that flock, and we target feed them. We use alternative feeds, and we're using body condition scoring. Again, because of electronic ID and weighing platforms, then we can body condition large number of ewes and manage and draft them accordingly. We have to be careful that we don't increase weight of lamb wean per ewe just simply by increasing ewe body weight, and I just put that in there about maintenance requirements. You know, the New Zealand industry is really aware that if they push ewe live weight out too high, maintenance requirements are going to go up, and we can run into problems. There's a bit of a dichotomy there with bigger ewes have bigger lambs and bigger carcasses, but it's certainly something that has to be watched on the maternal side. As I said, there's a change from a one-mob approach in that farmers are now thinking about how they manage their ewe flocks in separate mobs. They're targeted feeding, they're feeding ewes in poorer condition, all aimed at trying to bring everything up rather than just farm on averages. And so that they're splitting their ewe flock based on condition midwinter and feeding some groups to reach their optimum body condition score. And that certainly saves feed, because those of you who know New Zealand, we still don't grow enough feed in the winter to be able to manage our ewe flock successfully. We still have to ration through the winter by rotational grazing, and so there has to be some saving if we're going to increase production, say in multiples, or improve ewe conditions so that they milk better through lactation. We have the problem, so this is quite a visual slide, and it's very good for students to appreciate. That's a ewe that's got triplets, has to eat 3.25 kilograms of dry matter in the first couple of weeks of lactation, and that's about 22 kilograms of wet pasture. It's an awful lot of food processed through its ruminant. And if you're on a grass-based system, that is still the problem. So our ewes, it's a challenge if we're going to feed on a grass-based system, how we can, an all-grass system, how we get those ewes through the winter. We've come to one solution, and farmers have picked up quite quickly, that forage legumes offer a different pasture, faster rumen flow rate, higher energy value, some anthelmintic properties as well. So this is plantain, chicory, red and white clover. being fed, and we've put lactating ewes on that, improved weight of lamb weaned per ewe through lamb growth rate, through ewe milk production. Within our research group, we've milked a lot of ewes on research trials just to try and relate milk production to lamb growth, and this is the only time we've actually got an increase in ewe milk production when they've been grazing this herb pasture. And the other thing there, you can see that you can only see one lamb standing up and you see the head. We unexpectedly got improved survival because those herb pastures stand up to about 10 or 11 or 12 centimetres, and so there is a bit of natural shelter there as well when you're lambing outside. So the opportunity there is being picked up by farmers, but remember I said sheep flocks have been pushed back into the harder hill country, so there's less area that they can actually do that. But this might bring sheep farming back onto the lower levels where a ewe with 3 lambs there, each weighing 30 kilograms, 90 kilograms of ewe weaned from a 60 or 70 kilogram ewe, sort of brings it up into approaching the average dairy farmer. Beef. There's potential in the beef industry to produce certainly 700 kilograms of beef per hectare, and with Frisian bulls, people have gone out towards 1,000. A bit easier with Frisian bulls because the calf's coming on at 100 kilos and going out at 15 to 18 months. And again, we've used this system is quite a popular beef system. So pick about 400 to 500. Actually, it's a bit less now. It's about 350 to 400 calves from the dairy industry are picked up each year, male calves, usually of Frisian breeding at 3 months of age, and moved onto our sheep farms and become the beef system on those farms, and are taken through to carcasses around 300 kilos with average live weight gains of 1 to 1.1 kilo throughout their lifetime. The weakness, though, is when the little calves go on the sheep farms at 100 kilos in November, December, when pasture quality starts to deteriorate through the summer months. And so, again, those herb pastures, we've been able to grow these young bulls from November through to November through to May at over 1 kilogram a day, up as high as 1.3. And so you're in a position there where you're able to turn a 300 kilogram bull off pasture by November when it's 15 months old at 300 kilos, which is a huge efficiency. We like that system when you talk about environmental efficiency, because the calf has been picked up from the dairy industry, which carries most of the overhead in terms of the environmental footprint. The calf's the byproduct. And so when you think about and I'll come back to that point later, when you think about no beef cow herd needed to pick up those animals, it becomes quite important. There's still surplus capacity in our dairy industry to produce more beef. It can be a source of suckler cow requirements. Replacements, the traditional suckler cow is Angus or Hereford, but there is increasing use of Hereford Friesian, and other people are thinking of Angus Friesian or Angus Jersey as well. And one-spread heifers is also a potential again. And when you think of using the dairy industry as a source of calf replacements, again, that improves efficiency and reduces the beef environmental footprint. And we're looking at different cows in the terms of efficiency. Big cows such as the Angus, and then big cows such as with low milk, then big cows with high milk performance such as Angus Friesian, and then all the way down to low milk Angus Jersey. So the idea there is more calves, heavier calves, but not just from bigger cows, from smaller or medium-sized cows. It's the same scenario as what I mentioned earlier in the sheep flock. That space is still to be uplifted by the industry. I mean, the dairy expansion has been so huge that no dairy farmer wants to use beef genetics at this moment. But that will change, and the global milk price dropping about 40% in the last 3 or 4 months will indicate whether there'll be an increased use of beef semen in dairy herds this coming spring. There is opportunity for niche markets for branded grass-finished beef, such as Angus Pure, or there is some Wagyu in New Zealand, and the Angus Pure scenario, 100% New Zealand, grass-fed, natural Angus beef, trying to be marketed with the story and when co-products such as New Zealand wine into specifically into targeted markets like Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. So that's an area that our processors and farmers that are linked together in supply chains to try and up the game in that area. We still have the problem though, and I was interested in the talk this morning about the lower value part of the carcass. There's no doubt that we can market our high value, which is only 18% of the carcass, but returns about 2.6, as opposed to the processing or ingredient beef, which is 60% of the carcass and only returns 45% by value or on a ratio basis of 1. So that 18% returns 34%, and that 60% only returns 45%. That's based on our export prices. So we still have that problem of, we spend a lot of time about the high quality beef, but still a large percentage of our exports is processing, but in terms of their return, it's much less. This is free on board value, $5, whereas the high value stuff is around $10, $11. So we still have some effort there to try and think up products to move that processing beef. And I take the point from this morning where it's that processed beef, the story that it's grass-fed. McDonald's quite like picking it up because it's grass-fed, but then they do things to it that maybe take away the health aspect further on down the line. But there is a lot of work to be done there. And then, of course, we get this message, which just came recently, and some of you have seen it in the press. This is really based on the US, and so our TV News in New Zealand picked this up 2 weeks ago, and everyone was asking for comments about how does that relate to New Zealand. So producing beef is 10 times as environmentally costly as chicken, pork or dairy, says an Israeli-American researcher, and the study there was based on US farming systems. The answer to that in New Zealand is that most New Zealand beef cattle are run with sheep on permanent pasture on hill country, where there is very little other opportunity to run any other livestock. You couldn't grow crops on it, and the only other alternative land uses, as I said, is sheep and sometimes deer, or retired into forestry. So, and then we have tried some life cycle analysis in New Zealand to try and see what the footprint of beef is. This is a modelled analysis of some case studies Gross Farm managed. The top lines are different. What the graph shows here is that there's a base farm here, and we've moved up and improved productivity or changing the beef system to more productive systems, so moving from the base farm here to a higher calving percentage, to one-spread heifers, which is getting animals from the dairy industry, to steer finishing, so the farmer doesn't have any cows on their farm, to bull beef, which is, I'm having problems here, to bull beef, which is, again, getting everything from the dairy industry, and the last one, where the line drops down, so if we take the top one as the gross margin, it drops down here, so we go up as we go to a more productive beef system, and then the bottom one here is the carbon footprint. The total carbon footprint. So again, it just shows you that as we move to where the animals are produced from the dairy herd, we have a lower carbon footprint. So, and then we've also done some figures on the methane emissions, kilogram per kilogram of meat from average sheep meat calculated 2 or 3 years ago it was. And so it's been going down since 1998. The methane emitted per kilogram per kg of product, in this case lamb meat, has been going down consistently since 1990. So there are some future challenges though. There's no doubt about that carbon footprint and the trade barrier. When you think of 90% of our product being exported, trade barriers can hurt us in a big way. Water supply is important, and water quality. It's more an issue at the moment in the dairy industry, although because most of our hill country, where our sheep and beef are farmed, feed into the catchments where dairy farms is, so there is issues there with sediment and phosphorus runoff from those hill country properties. So the two big nutrients are nitrogen and phosphorus. And already on our dairy farms there is nutrient budgeting, and we're going to see in the very foreseeable future nutrient budgeting for our sheep and beef farmers as well. So there'll be limits on what you can do and how much fertiliser you can put on, how much N you can put on, if any. So the probable future is that it's going to increase focus on individual sheep production rather than the whole big mob approach. And individual electronic identification will make that easier. So no one sees us returning to large numbers of sheep in the New Zealand flock. It's probably going to settle around that 30 million. Farms will get larger. Labour, as in other parts of the world, labour will be more difficult as young people want to live in cities. Compliance costs are obviously going to increase, whether it be nutrient budgeting, whether it be the water footprint, or whether it be traceability. All those are given, and I like the talk this morning where they said they will actually become marketing initiatives and advantages if we're into that early. So 3 areas, just to go back over some of the things I said before, there's 3 areas where we can generate more product. And I've said generate more product. I haven't put quality into this because already we think our quality of our lamb production is reasonable. So these are just at the margin, if you like. So if we were able to lift mated hoggets from 30 to 60% number of lamb stock in our hoggets, which the national average is only 60 to 90, we'd generate an extra 3.6 million lambs, which would go a long way to filling the hole that China has picked up of all sheep meat. If we could improve lamb survival from 80 to 90, we'd generate an extra 3 million lambs again. So there's 6 million. And if we can do what the aged farming generation, that's now 58, if the young people coming through and taking over our farms can increase lambing percentage from 120 up towards 140, which is easily achievable because there's plenty of sheep genetics in New Zealand that are doing 140, lambs weaned, ewes mated, then we can generate another 6 million lambs. So there is plenty of scope within New Zealand to increase our production. But there will be some biological limits. The antagonism between fast growth of lambs and ewe hoggets to get to those mating weights that I mentioned, or to get to those lamb weaning weights, putting pressure upwards on mature size, so there has to be some thinking done there. The ewe capacity to eat in relation to body size, especially in late pregnancy. Concentrate feeding is not on in New Zealand because they're in hill country, so it has to be grass, and so it has to be managed to be able to do that. And whether the better forages we're bringing in, increasing energy intake per kg eaten, or are we sort of in the future going to be able to manipulate rumen microorganisms somehow, or maybe the better forages are actually doing that already. So the good news is that New Zealand will take up the challenge and will fill and keep filling that 7% of the world lamb meat that's traded. It will still keep its quota of beef into the USA and is trying hard to divert the other 50% into Asian markets. But one thing is certain is that the amount and quality of our feed that we grow, and when you think of climate change, we will have winners and losers in New Zealand. We're not really frightened of climate change because the South Island will grow a whole lot more grass and the North Island will become sort of subtropical and be able to grow some different crops such as maize. So climate change won't destroy or alter the forage makeup component of our New Zealand sheep and beef cattle production. Thank you.